Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Not bad, Nick. How are you?
Fantastic. Another podcast Friday.
Here we are, getting back in the groove.
Back to our regularly scheduled programming, right?
Yes, yes.
Till something crazy
Till
happens
something
in the
else comes
market.
up, right?
So, speaking of the market, this today's topic does have some. Oh, what's the word I'm looking for, Dave? It does have it does tend to lean towards what's happening today
Yeah,
in the
it's timely.
markets.
Yeah,
Timely,
yeah,
yes, there you go.
yeah.
So we've been getting a lot of questions around the housing market and really kind of how do you make decisions in the housing market in today's rate environment, which we've seen the Fed basically increase the interest rate at an accelerated pace over the last year, and are looking to still continue to do a couple more rate increases. So how do you think about that, and how do you think about the different housing choices, knowing that we're in this rising interest rate environment,
Well,
and we don't really know how long rates are going to stay high, right?
and it's a rising interest rate environment on the back of a very fast moving real estate market since
Yeah, so we've
since
kind of got
2020.
a
So,
double whammy of
right,
housing prices going way up and then interest rates going way up.
right. So all of a sudden the sticker itself is more expensive and the interest cost built into that, yeah, it's just really changed the math of home buying lately.
Yeah, and from what I have heard, and maybe this is a future topic where we bring on a real estate person, but the people that I know that are out there kind of looking at houses is the problem right now is there's not a lot of houses on the market, but there's still a lot of people looking to buy
Right.
houses. And so that creates this where, normally we would think, okay, interest rates go up, mortgages are higher, so housing prices are going to come down, and that
Hmm.
really isn't what we have seen. We're starting to kind of see it a little bit, but not nearly as much as what you would think at this point.
Right. Well, and I think part of that is that the inflation in prices over the last couple of years, there's been some weirdness about the COVID crisis that maybe affected our thinking a little bit, but by and large, we've just built since the financial crisis slowed development down. We've built about a million too few homes every year for like the last 12 years, and
Hmm.
um, you know, that those statistics are coming out of a couple articles from last spring, and I think they're still valid. But whether the numbers are exact or not, it really comes down to the fact that there's too few homes for too many buyers right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole pandemic and all the supply chain issues, and we've talked about this on podcasts before, that's not helping the situation, right?
Right,
Like we're not like actively trying to make up that gap. We're just trying to survive and build the
right,
houses that we can at this point.
right,
So
right, right.
it's an interesting time as far as the housing market's concerned. So, what I wanted to do today, Dave, is we've gotten some questions of some different scenarios from clients over the past, 6 months or so. And so we've kind of changed some of the parameters of these around a little bit. But I just want to go through a couple of different scenarios that we're seeing come up as people try to make decisions in this kind of in this rate environment with everything that's going on with the housing market. And so the first scenario that comes to mind that we've helped a couple of people through is, should I buy or should I rent?
Yeah, and we get this question isn't unique to this market, right? We get this on a monthly basis going back for as long as I've been doing financial planning. Um, it's always a thought provoking question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of one of those where it's one of those things that for, many, many years, the way to the American dream of wealth is buy a house, right?
Hmm.
And pay it off because that's how you're going to build wealth over time. And it's kind of like this, we could probably do a survey of people that have heard that or had similar stories. And most people believe it to be true. Whether or not it is, we can kind of debate and talk about the
Yeah,
numbers. But
yeah,
either way, most people believe it is true. And just like everything that we talk about in financial planning, there's no like hard and fast line that says every person should own a house. It's the only way to build wealth, right?
right, right.
So let's go. This scenario that comes up quite a bit is, let's say you have a young couple, and in this scenario, I threw some curveballs in this one for you, Dave. So young couple, not married, want to buy their first house together. So they're currently paying rent. We'll call it about $1,250 a month, with everything included. They'd like to buy a house and then keep their payment around $1,500 a month. Their parents have come in and said they'd be willing to help them with a down payment. Currently, they don't have a lot in savings, but they are both working full time. But the other caveat to this whole scenario is they'd like to move to a different state in 3 to 5 years and get rid of winter. They got good credit. They've been pre-qualified for a 30-year mortgage. Current rate at about 7.25%, which means their high-end home range would be about 175,000 or so to make all that math work out.
Okay.
So the question, I guess, there, Dave, is buy or rent, and we're probably gonna have to unpack a lot of that before we can answer it. But
yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind right away out of this scenario, and so yes, the difference between rental payments and mortgage payments is $250 in this case, and if you actually get to own the home, that in and of itself doesn't seem like that big a difference, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, that's not including, we're kind of pretending that rent amount is you get in everything included. So,
Yeah. Yep.
Then you've got to figure not just utilities, but property taxes, insurance. But more importantly, I think people don't think about the amount of money they spend on home improvement and maintenance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, when you're thinking about equating these things, right, you've got to take all those costs in, and you've got to make some guesses. And then, the classical studies of these kind of scenarios, like true financial planning textbook cases, would take that and say, okay, now say the true cost of owning the home is $2,000 a month when you figure everything in. So then, the difference is $750 a month, right? Well, what if that renter then took that $750 a month and invested it instead of, putting it in their house? How much equity in the house would they have versus how much would they have in their portfolio, say in 30 years, right? But there's flaws in that thinking. And the first thing that comes to mind with that is human nature. The one thing that works about, the 30-year mortgage that we've all been trained as the key to middle class wealth is that it does force discipline on you, right?
Yeah.
You essentially are taking, that $1,500 a month is going to your mortgage payment in this scenario. A portion of that every month is basically going to purchase your equity, right? Some of it's going to interest, but some of it is going to equity. So that when that mortgage is paid off, you own that equity, and you've intentionally, it's really similar to putting that money in a piggy bank in a way, right?
Right.
And so that's one reason why it works, is because it forces people that might otherwise spend that difference between rent and mortgage doing whatever, it forces them to save and creates that savings account in a way in their house.
Right.
But on the other hand, the things that come to mind in terms of like guiding a client in this situation, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, you want to buy a house, but you think you want to move in 3 to 5 years, and not just you want to move out of state. That's not a long enough time frame for me to expect you to recapture all the front end costs of buying a house. Not to mention the fact that in a short term like that, who knows what direction the housing market's going to go, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So one thing that, the trade-off between building equity and renting is flexibility, right? When you're buying a house, you're marrying that house for, at least a long enough time to know that you're doing well, to get through any market volatility. When you're renting, you can pretty much, within the terms of your lease, be done in, usually 12 months is the term, right?
Yeah.
So you can time things and say, okay, we're going to move to New York in April because our lease here is up in May, and we're done. Yeah. And so, when you don't know where you want to be or what you want to do, that
Hmm.
flexibility is worth something,
Oh yeah.
you know. And we probably should have looked up the ballpark upfront costs on a mortgage right now, not just the down payment, because that,
Right.
going to, but the closing costs and
Closing
everything else.
costs. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
probably typically, and it's been a while since I looked, but $2,000 to $2,500 would be my guess as
yeah,
kind of a ballpark for that. And
yeah,
then there's the back end too, right? If you're going to sell your
hmm,
house in 5 years, then you got to pay the commission, real estate commission, and all that stuff. That's 6%
yeah,
plus all the other expenses of listing and all that. So, it's just a great reminder that, even though you turn on HGTV and there's thousands of shows that show you how these people can flip houses in a short
yeah,
amount of time and make a
yeah,
bunch of money,
yeah,
that's not the reality of the
yeah,
world we live in, right?
yeah.
And your point about flexibility is a great one too, Dave, because if you decide to move, you don't have to worry about what the value of your house is that you're going to sell it at. If
Right,
you're renting, you can just pick up and move, and that the value of the housing market has no impact on you
right.
if you're renting, right?
Yeah, and another point here, in addition to moving, this couple isn't married,
Yeah,
and not to impose any judgments on that, but boy, if you're going to buy a house together, you might as well be married, right?
yeah.
So really think about that relationship
Hmm.
and how that plays out, because there are, if you buy a house together and then separate, there's legal ramifications, and you've got to think about
Right,
how you're gonna split the china,
right.
so um just be cognizant of that. And I think what I would tell this couple is, unless they've got like a screaming deal in front of them that they feel they have to buy, they're probably
Hmm.
further ahead to save for that house 3 to 5 years from now when they move to the place they think they want to be long term. You know.
Yeah, I would definitely tend to agree with you there. And back to the marriage thing, right? And there's a couple different variables that we could throw into this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it you're not getting married because you don't believe in marriage, but you want to be with this person forever, or you're
Mm-hmm.
not ready to make that commitment?
Right.
Because, like you said, buying a house together is basically making that
Yeah.
commitment.
Yeah. I mean, it's not quite having kids together, but it's up
Yeah,
there, right? It's
and then
a
just
step above a dog and a step below kids.
there you go, there
so
you go.
so yeah, that flexibility you get in renting is probably worth it, and that commitment to saving what you can right now towards that 3 to 5 year purchase may both help the relationship and help speed that decision making along.
Yeah, I
So
agree. Another thing that I think about here too, and we can wrap this one up, but just cash flow in general. So we talked a little bit about, the payment would be a little bit higher than the rent, which isn't a big deal, but there's all those other expenses that go into it. And, I see this a lot where parents want to help kids make a down payment on a house, which I think is great. But also for a young couple, I think it's super important that you can show that you can save for your own down payment
yeah,
so that that those increased expenses aren't going to be that big of a deal when you get in there and you actually buy a house and spend more
right.
on rent than you normally have been in the
Well,
past.
and parents need to think about how that influences decision making, right?
Right, for
In
sure.
the insurance world, they talk about what's called a moral hazard, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in
Mm-hmm.
this case, what it would be is, okay, if I say to my son or daughter, I'm willing to give you $10,000 towards a down payment on a house. Well, if that's all I'm going to give them that money for, they're going to go find a house, right?
Right. Yeah.
So whether they checked those boxes we just talked about is it where we want to be long term, is it the right financial cash flow decision, is it are we committed enough to each other to own a house together, all of that stuff kind of gets chucked by the wayside because mom and dad are ready to help us out. They're not giving us money to move to a new state, they're giving us money
Right.
to buy a house.
Yeah.
And then you go and want to sell that house 3 to 5 years to move to where you want to be, and maybe it doesn't go well financially, and then everybody's kind of it's going to make for a real awkward Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, for sure. And
So,
it's, you got to be careful as parents of the behavior that you're trying to
right,
incent, right?
right.
Like maybe you, instead of saying, hey, we'll pay for your down payment, maybe if your goal is to get them on better financial footing, maybe you say, hey, if you save up 10 grand in the next couple of years, we'll match it for a down payment or whatever else you want it to be. And so then you're trying to help them get on the right page in terms of doing the things financially, but not saying, hey, you have to go out and buy a house, even if maybe you don't want to, because that's what I'm giving you money for,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Got to be careful with that.
So great point. So let's go to scenario two real quick because we've had a lot of this lately as well. So scenario two is the do I move or do I stay? Right. So we've got a couple that's retiring. They would, part of their retirement goal is to own a lake house up north. So they currently have, a bigger house, 4 bedroom, 3 bathroom, but their kids have moved out and they no longer need the space and don't want to take care of such a large house. So in this scenario that we made up, the house is worth about 350. So they still owe about 100,000. Have a mortgage at 3.25 because they locked in a couple of years ago with 12 years left on it. Based on their research, they're thinking a new house would cost about 450 to 500,000. So they don't have assets that they have available to pay for the increase in costs. Most of their retirement assets are locked up in 401k type accounts. So they're thinking, if they did this, they'd probably need a new mortgage of around 250,000 at today's rates.
Yeah, yeah.
So, how do they decide whether to move or stay?
Oh boy, this we have a tendency to reduce everything to a math problem, right? But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you know, in a way, you have to, right? The first thing as a financial planner we'd want to see is, okay, if we're going to mortgage $250,000 at today's rates, what's that payment going to look like? And what does
Yep.
that mean for this couple's cash flow? Where's that going to come from in their retirement assets?
Yeah.
Um, but, bigger picture, yeah, um, coming from a guy who's, I chuckle. We made an assumption here that our listeners are all in Michigan and understand that, you know, the Southeast Michigan is the metro area, and you go
Uh
up
huh.
north for vacations and to retire. I've spent
Right.
most of my life north of the 45th parallel in Michigan, up north, and I tell clients that are thinking this, because this is a very common question for our Lansing and Grand Rapids area and Detroit area folks. You know, do rent for a summer.
Yeah.
Don't well, and more important, if this is going to be your year-round home, get up there in the winter and
Yeah.
and don't just play tourist. Think about, like, what does grocery shopping look like on a weekly basis? What does, am I going to be happy in this town that's maybe a vibrant place in August, but is maybe a little bit drear in February?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not for everybody. And
Yeah.
so, back to that idea of flexibility, the scenario here that I might advise is, hey, you're just retiring. Um, do a month, rent a place for a month in the summer and a month in the winter.
Yep.
Go try it out.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, if you got it right, you'd be better off buying and not wasting money on the rental. But that's kind of a cheap insurance policy to make sure before you sell house A to buy house B, and which is kind of crossing the Rubicon in a way. Um, you've given it a try, and um, not just decided that, what was great when we vacationed with the kids over, summer break is where we want to spend the rest of our lives.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, people sometimes, they have an idea in their
It's
mind of what they
romanticized.
want,
Yeah.
but they don't necessarily, like you said, because they went for a weekend vacation. But it's very different living in, the northern parts of Michigan, which are known for colder winters, more snow, more isolation, less access to the everyday life that you might be accustomed to in a Lansing or Detroit or Grand Rapids. And so I think that's a great point to, try that stuff out. kind of a funny story. So I went to Northern Michigan, as you know, Dave, which is up in Marquette in the UP. And my brother-in-law was in the recruiting department up there for a while, and he told me, and I'm going to get the stats totally wrong, but they're close to this. They would do visits in the summer, and like 80% of those kids would end up going to school there.
Yes.
And they would do visits in the winter, and it was like 10% of those
Yeah.
kids would end up going to school there.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah.
So you definitely want to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting into
Right.
before you make a huge decision like buying a house that size
Yeah.
and moving everything before you're sure that's really what you want.
And to extrapolate it more to maybe the rest of the country than just our Michigan environment. A lot of it, I think, is the rural versus suburb metro divide. Yeah. And for me it works, but I know a lot of people that it doesn't work well for. Yeah. And there's always trade-offs that maybe on a week's vacation you don't pick up on quite as readily.
Yep. So for this couple, another thing that I would also consider is, what does this mean for your retirement projections? And what I mean by that is, if you're planning on having X amount of money in retirement on a monthly income basis, what is that? If you increase your housing costs, right? If you're going to go out and double, maybe even close to triple, if we talk about the increase in interest rate, your housing costs, what does that mean for your overall monthly budget? And are there things you're going to not be able to do or be able to, or maybe you don't travel, right? Or maybe instead of traveling 3 times a year, you can only travel once. Like, what are the trade-offs? Because there's always going to be a trade-off there of what are we not going to be able to do because we have more of our resources allocated to travel. And just go through that exercise and make sure you're comfortable with what those trade-offs are.
Yeah. And, on one hand, when we look at this kind of scenario, what they're really doing, right, is shifting money from income resources to real estate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's a bigger piece of real estate than they currently own. That's, if we think about somebody's net worth as their entire portfolio, in the current situation, they've got $250,000 invested in real estate, right? Mm-hmm. And they're going to go to having, eventually, as they pay down the mortgage that they'd have to borrow, they'll have a bigger slice in real estate. And so while we don't usually, like when I build a plan, at least if we can avoid it, we don't include somebody's home equity in their resources, right? Unless the plan isn't working. And then we have to talk about reverse mortgages or downsizing. But the bigger piece of the pie you make your real estate portion of your overall net worth, the more important it is to think about, what would my exit strategy be if I live long enough or the markets don't do well and I start to run out of money? Am I willing to sell this piece of property? How would I get that equity back out if I had to? Right. And like I said, for most people, we try to make things work without having to. That's kind of the backup plan, right? But the bigger that, the more expensive your house is, the more important a role it may play in the future. And that just, not everybody's willing to think like that. So needs to be part of the calculus.
That's a great point. And, another thing I think of in a scenario like this, which we haven't really talked about, but, from a mortgage interest rate standpoint, it's not a great time. If you're I guess what I'm getting at is, I wouldn't let that be the deciding factor of, hey, I'm going to wait to do this until interest rates come back down.
If you can still afford the payment.
Right.
With the higher interest rates. I wouldn't not buy a house just because the interest rate per se is higher than it was 2 years ago. I think we have to keep perspective that the rates we've been dealing with for the last 10 years are way lower than normal mortgage rates, right? And we've kind of gotten spoiled, but we've kind of, our mind anchors on things that like 3% to 4%, that's the normal, right? And, and nowhere close to normal. But what I would say, if you're going to take a mortgage at 7.25%, I'd be watching the rate market,
for sure.
and be thinking, okay, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road, I'm refinancing,
Yep,
you know,
absolutely.
um, to save your overall interest cost over your lifetime.
Hmm.
Or it changes how we think about the question of, do we pay our mortgage down versus staying invested?
Yeah,
You know,
that's another great one. And just in terms of like, yeah, do you pay extra on the mortgage knowing it's a higher rate, or go with a 15-year as opposed to a 30-year knowing that it's a higher rate? I mean, those are all things that you would want to consider
yeah.
in a scenario like this, but I don't think it's I'm not going to do this because the rates are higher if I can
Hmm.
still do it, right?
That's
Like
that's my
it's not a deal breaker.
right. That's my take on it.
And there, it goes back to this, and I know we've talked about this before too, but some people don't want to have any debt in retirement, and
Hmm.
some people are comfortable with it. So you also have to figure out where you fall on that spectrum of, are you
Absolutely.
okay having housing debt, having a mortgage, even though you're not working anymore? How do you feel about that? How's that going to drive your decision making and your
Right.
enjoyment of retirement?
Right. Right. Never simple, is it? We never can give a
No,
straightforward answer. It'd be
no, it's
nice if everything
not.
could just well, give me the numbers. I'll throw it in my calculator and tell you exactly what you should do. Taxes,
Yeah.
you can do that a little bit, but with the
Yep.
rest of this, not so much.
Yeah, so hopefully that's some good advice and some things people can consider as they're making these decisions. We would love to have our listeners, if you have a scenario like this that you want to hear our thoughts on in the podcast, feel free to shoot that over to info at
Yeah.
srbadvisors.com. Be happy to keep you confidential, but would love to kind of give you some feedback or our thoughts on what you should consider and how you should attack a decision like this.
Yeah. If it's on your mind, I guarantee it's on the mind of a lot of other people too. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, this was great, Dave. Thanks for playing along,
Yeah.
and
It's fun.
we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Nick.